Well, welcome to this 10th talk on the Reformation, where we're looking to what extent the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s was religious in nature and to what extent, if at all, it was spiritual in nature. And if you've been listening to these talks, you will have discovered that I fall largely, if not exclusively, on the former option. In the last talk, Calvin and Farel had just been ignominiously ejected from Geneva. From there, they traveled on to Bâle, but then Farel was called away to serve the church in Neuchâtel, and Calvin was invited to Strasbourg to serve as a minister in a French church which catered for refugees from France. So that was a nice little niche for John Calvin. During his stay in Strasbourg, which lasted about 3 years, he wrote a new edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion and a commentary on the Romans. So he was very busy in writing. However, during this time, another issue came back to haunt him, which I don't think I'd mentioned. In 1537, when he'd been laboring in Geneva, he had been accused of heresy, namely of having a false view of the Trinity. The person who brought this accusation was a rather erratic figure called Pierre Caroli. He had been vacillating between the Catholic Church and the evangelical faith, but now professed to be on the side of the Reformation. Caroli had been installed by the Bernese authorities as the main minister in Lausanne. After reports by Caroli, Bern was very concerned that it might be associated with heresy. So Calvin and Farel had to make a defense of their beliefs before them because it was Caroli who had impugned them and said they were teaching heresy concerning the nature of Jesus Christ and the Trinity. However, upon investigation, Calvin and Farel were vindicated in the matter, and Caroli returned to the Catholic Church after being deposed by Bern. However, the problem for Calvin and Farel was that the rumors of heresy wouldn't go away, and time and energy was taken up in trying to squash the rumors. It was a stressful, exhausting, and exasperating time for Calvin and Farel and their close friend Pierre Viret, who was also in Lausanne at that time. So that was in 1537. But only after 2 years, in 1539, when Calvin was in Strasbourg, Caroli reappeared, seeking reconciliation. He claimed that he'd only gone back to the Catholic Church because of what he'd thought was the false teachings of Calvin and Farel. Caroli went to Neuchâtel, where Farel was, and managed to convince him with his story. Farel was glad to receive him back, believing that Caroli was genuine and seeking reconciliation. Caroli then went to Strasbourg, where Calvin was, in order to put things right with the leading reformers there, which included a leading reformer by the name of Martin Butzer, who I have mentioned before. The reformers he spoke to there made it clear that they disapproved of his former actions, but on the other hand, were happy to receive him back. Calvin, on the other hand, was incandescent with rage. I mentioned in the last talk how Calvin could take things very personally, and this certainly would be an example of that. Calvin declared that he would in no way receive Caroli unless he fully retracted the accusations of heresy against him. Martin Butzer and other reformers endeavored to mediate in the matter. Calvin was invited to give his version of things and to enumerate Caroli's faults before them. Calvin refused, very much doubting Caroli's sincerity and believing it would be a never-ending battle of words. The next day, Calvin had to meet with the leading reformers again for him to look at some statements or articles, as they were called, that Caroli had agreed to. But this time, Calvin blew up in a rage. He totally lost it. Calvin accused his own colleagues and friends of working behind his back, of prejudging the issue, and put the blame on Farel for having been so naive in the beginning. Calvin was so distraught that he couldn't comply with their request that evening. Calvin himself later wrote about the incident in a letter to Farel, saying about that evening, "There I sinned grievously in not being able to keep within bounds, for bile had taken possession of my mind to the extent that I poured out bitterness on all sides. I complained that they had presented these articles to me for the purpose of exonerating Caroli, and that it was their opinion that these articles were good, while I was unheard, and judgment had already been pronounced. They required me to subscribe to the articles, which, if I refused, would turn them into my adversaries. At last, I forced myself out of the dining room. Butzer followed, and when he had soothed me by his gentle words, he brought me back to the company. I said that I wished to consider the matter more fully before making any more distinct reply. When I got home, I was seized with an extraordinary paroxysm, nor did I find any other solace than in sighs and tears. And I was the more deeply afflicted because you, Farel, had occasioned those evils for me. Again and again, they reminded me of your leniency, who had mercifully embraced Caroli upon the spot, saying that I was too headstrong and could not be moved 1 inch from my judgment." That's what Calvin wrote about it. Opposition from enemies, Calvin could and would react to with force in writing and in preaching. He seemed to need public vindication and triumph, as we shall see later. However, emotionally and mentally, Calvin couldn't cope with a situation where it was now his colleagues who are finding fault with him. The fact that there was no prospect of changing his friends' minds about him and about Caroli was completely unbearable and intolerable to him. His frustration knew no bounds, and he exploded with bitter accusations all round and against his friends. And upon arriving home, he fell victim to a kind of emotional breakdown of frustration. It really does seem that Calvin needed to feel vindicated and to be seen to be vindicated, and even to triumph over his perceived enemies. And this trait emerges later on in his dealings with his opponents. And that's the reason really why I've included this part in this kind of biography. It is an indication of his temperament and personality, because later he sees himself as being on God's side and God being on his side, and it becomes easy for him therefore to just justify his own temperamental disposition, especially when he's got the power to do so. And here the fact that he had no course of redress to restore his eminence and reputation, absolutely, he couldn't cope with it. He just could not cope with it, which is a revealing feature. And I only mention it because I think it impinges on what happens in many other situations. Now, in the meantime, things were not going very well in Geneva. The church in particular was very much lacking leadership and competent ministers. And now the Catholic Church, through a particular cardinal called Jacopo Sadoleto, was making overtures to the city of Geneva about returning to the fold. Sadoleto wrote so convincingly that neither Geneva nor Bern had anyone capable of replying in kind. Calvin was approached to compose a reply, which he did. That was at the end of 1539. In September 1540, the Council of Geneva then instructed one of its members, Amy Perrin, to oversee the recall of Calvin. However, this first request was refused. Calvin wrote to Farel saying, quote, "Whenever I call to mind the wretchedness of my life, how can it not be but that my very soul must shudder at any prospect for my return? When I remember by what torture my conscience was racked at that time, and with how much anxiety it was continually boiling over, forgive me if I dread the place as having about it something of a fatality in my case." However, during this time, Calvin also expressed himself at other times in terms of being open to God's will, should God make that clear. And also initially, Strasbourg itself didn't want Calvin to go. But as the overtures from Geneva continued, at last Calvin agreed to return. However, he gave the Genevan Council to understand that he would only return on his terms, as had been expressed during his first stay. To this they agreed, and he was warmly received back in Geneva in September 1541. He'd been away for about 3 years. Upon arrival, Calvin immediately set about drafting what were called ordinances, instructions, regulations for the ordering of the Christian religion in Geneva. And these ordinances related to the government, administration, and life of the church. And in November, they were passed by the Genevan councils, who nevertheless made some significant changes to them. For example, a pastor could be installed only with the final approval of the council. Likewise, a pastor could only be deposed by a decision of the council and not by the decision of the clerics. In the amendments made to the ordinances, it was made clear that the ministers are subject to civil law and that the final sentence of punishment was their prerogative. Consistory, I have difficulty in pronouncing this word. Consistory court was set up, and it was responsible for church discipline. But it consisted of the ministers, I think about half a dozen in number, and 12 laymen. But these 12 laymen were chosen from the councils. This meant that in the consistory, the council members outnumbered the ministers, which again gave the council control in decisions, at least potentially anyway. Moreover, the president of this body was to be the executive magistrate of the council. Now, when I read these things up, I was surprised. I didn't read anything about Calvin's reaction to this. I was very surprised that Calvin didn't kick up a fuss about the amendments, as they seem to land him in a similar, if not identical, situation as before during his first stay. And of course, they did lay the ground for future tensions and conflicts between the ministers, the clerics, and the councils. So it's beyond me why he agreed to those council amendments. So it's no great surprise that embittered opposition started growing against Calvin. This is an inevitable result when you start moralizing in the name of God's law to a large community of unwilling people. Calvin wanted to apply God's word and God's law to the people, but opposition and defiance resulted from him trying to do this, as I've said before, in a Christianized community among people, many, if not most of whom were not truly converted, as can be seen from the historical accounts of these troubles. It was a bit like, or very much like, the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. There was bound to be conflict in this kind of recipe. It wasn't so much that the people were against the Reformation itself, which basically they weren't, but against Calvin's imposition of rules and regulations that deprived the citizens of the personal liberties and pleasures that they had been used to. Parker, the historian, states it like this, quote, "The troubles were caused by two factors. The one, the undisciplined willfulness and fear of a strong section of the community. The other, that blend of determination, excitability, and intelligence that constituted Calvin's character." So the biographies and histories all bear these things out. In fact, it was about 10 years later, when Calvin felt that he'd been defeated in these struggles, that he handed in a letter of resignation to the city authorities, but the council refused his letter of resignation. However, Calvin did gain some respite and help when in 1546, new ministers from France arrived who came to replace others who had left. They were well-educated ministers and sympathetic to Calvin's work of Reformation. Although one of them, Michael Kopp, would soon be embroiled in a tumult that he had caused. Now, having extra clergy from France, however, only increased the anti-French feeling that was growing because of Calvin's dominating style. And this could only result in ongoing tensions and conflicts between the councils and Calvin. And that is exactly what happened. It was a recipe for trouble, if not disaster. Gradually, an opposition group developed against Calvin, and these included respectable and notable families in Geneva and important council members, including Aimé Perrin. The opposition group was given the name of Libertines because they were all for more liberty, or Perronists after Aimé Perrin. In the same year, 1546, and in the years that followed, there were grumblings and complaints from various citizens about this increase in French clergy. One, Claude, a wife of Durbin, complained about the number of French clergy being too numerous. And the next year, the following year, the watchman in Geneva, Francois Mestrat, wanted all the Frenchmen to be thrown into the Rhone River. It was not only dangerous, but also a crime of the state in Geneva to speak against Calvin and his teaching. At the beginning of 1546, one of the Libertine group, Cartelier by name, spoke against Calvin in no certain terms at supper in his own home. He was imprisoned, and Calvin comments, quote, "I testified to the judge that it would be agreeable to me were he proceeded against with the utmost rigor of the law," unquote. In March 1548, one citizen was banished from Geneva because he had written ballads against Calvin. I suppose it's no wonder that some people have called Calvin the Pope of Geneva. Just in your own home, speaking against Calvin, if other people got to know about it, into prison you go. In February, in the same letter as above, Calvin wrote to Farel saying, quote, With regard to those who gave out that they were establishing here a permanent seat of despotism, that is the reformers, the French ministers. There was this complaint that they were establishing a permanent seat of despotism under color of defense. Let us suffer this rumor to spread on both sides. Their impudence has been met with civility and mildness, so that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. I trust they will keep quiet. I seek as far as I'm able to persuade our friends to remain unconcerned." Unquote. Calvin certainly felt he had right, if not God, on his side, and seemed unperturbed by accusations of being a despot. But I quote these things because it shows clearly that there was a feeling among at least some in Geneva that he was acting like a pope. Amy Perrin's mother was bold enough to criticize Calvin before the consistory. The following is recorded, quote, "She continued to create insults at the said Mr. Calvin, among which are those that follow: that he came to Geneva to throw us into debates and wars, and that since he has been here, there has been neither profit nor peace. Moreover, she reproached him that he did not live as he preached, and that she never found love in him." Unquote. So there's multiple examples showing that there, as in his first visit, he soon stirred opposition against himself by the imposition of a moral code on people. Rightly or wrongly, quite a number of people, including important citizens of Geneva, were feeling the reformist style of imposing religion on them was creating strife and upset in the community. In January 1546, tensions rose between Calvin and the councils about the conduct of one Pierre Amor, who accused Calvin of being a mere Picard, a Frenchman, who preached false doctrine. Now, being a maker of playing cards, perhaps he had a particular reason to grumble about Calvin. Of course, to accuse Calvin of preaching false doctrine was considered a crime in Geneva, and Amor was arrested. He was tried by the Little Council and ordered to pay a fine of 60 crowns and to publicly acknowledge his fault. However, the council of the 200 who have to verify the small council's verdict or decision reduced the sentence, only requiring Amor to make an apology to Calvin before them. Calvin flatly refused to accept this as a punishment for the man's crime. Amor had impugned the name of God, claiming that the word of God was false doctrine. As I have mentioned earlier, Calvin, believing that he truly represented God's truth in his teaching, perceived any opposition to himself or his teaching as opposition to God and to God's truth. That's how he presented it. Others might say that he was a man too easily offended and who couldn't tolerate any personal criticism of himself. Anyway, Calvin threatens not to preach again unless the sentence was made more severe. This caused some tumult in the city, so the council of the 200 gave in and ordered that Amor be publicly paraded by making a circuit of the city in his shirt, in only his shirt, and carrying a torch and kneeling at certain places asking God's forgiveness. This seemed to satisfy Calvin's sense of justice, if not revenge, in suitably vindicating and restoring his reputation. It seems Calvin was buried in an Old Testament style religion and failed to show anything of the Spirit of Christ in these matters. A few months later, in April 1546, another crime was committed. Amy Perrin had held some of the most important positions on the Genevan Small Council. But by all accounts, he was a worldly man and dubbed by Calvin as our comic Caesar. Perrin was to take a leading part in the opposition that was growing against Calvin. A problem arose because it was reported that Perrin's wife, along with others, had danced at a wedding party, which was attended by other important citizens of Geneva. Among those who had danced were Amy Perrin himself and the president of the consistory court, one Amblard Corn. So they were imprisoned for having danced at the party and made to confess their crimes and apologize before being released. This is Reformation in Switzerland. Neither priest nor politician understood the gospel or preached the gospel. Neither priest nor politician understood what constituted the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. By means of the civic law, which was supposed to be founded on God's laws, they tried to make people righteous and upright and to cajole them with threats and imprisonment to be good Christians. It was a case of the blind leading the blind on the part of both pastor and politician. Where there is no regeneration, there will be legalism, and that of a Pharisaical sort. In other words, with an emphasis on the outward observance of rules and laws. By enforcing an outward conformity to certain behavior, Calvin and the state sought to Christianize the worldly and ungodly. With regard to the case of dancing, some denied any wrongdoing, which infuriated Calvin. Calvin relates his part in being able to force a confession from the wrongdoers by letting them know in no uncertain terms the consequences of their dishonesty. Moreover, Calvin used the pulpit to publicly inveigh against dancing and other terrible behavior. Calvin used his pulpit to publicly inveigh against dancing and other terrible behavior of the Genevans. Calvin writes about this to Farel, quote, "After your departure, the dancers caused us more trouble than I had supposed. All those present were summoned to the consistory, with the two exceptions of Corn and Perrin, where they shamelessly lied to God and us. I was incensed, as the vileness of the thing demanded, and I strongly inveighed against the contempt of God, in that they thought nothing of making a mockery of the sacred admonitions we had used. When I was finally informed of their state of ease, I could do nothing but call God to witness that they would pay the penalty for such perfidy. I at the same time announced my resolution to uncover the truth, even though it should be at the cost of my own life, lest they should imagine that any advantage should come of lying." With an extreme diligence, if not ruthlessness, Calvin sought to put out the fires of carnal, worldly conduct wherever and whenever they appeared in Geneva. Again, there was another attempt at this sort of Christianizing the community in Geneva. In 1546, there was attempts were made to change the nature of the taverns, that is, the drinking houses in Geneva. The taverns themselves were closed, and in their place, 5 religious public houses were opened. Here there would be food and drink as well as a French Bible available. There was to be no swearing or dancing, but psalms could be sung or a word given for the edification of the rest of the company, if anyone actually came. Grace was also to be said before and after eating and drinking. I just can't imagine why, the politicians and the Reformed ministers thought this could work. Talk about the blind leading the blind. So it should be no surprise to us that these religious public houses did not last long, and the taverns were soon back in business. Parker, in his biography of John Calvin, gives this attempt at converting the taverns into religious clubs. The term, he calls it sanctification of the taverns. And I think that the term sanctification of the tavern is most apt not only for this event, but for the whole of the Protestant Reformation. You cannot sanctify what is worldly, godless, and unregenerate. Here's the whole problem of the Protestant Reformation. And as an illustration of a failed enterprise, the attempted conversion of the taverns reflects the nature and the failure of the whole Protestant Reformation, in that it fails to truly change people's lives spiritually and inwardly first, by the preaching of the true evangelical gospel that leads people to repentance and changed lives, where now they themselves then choose not to go to pubs and to get drunk. And I believe something similar to this scenario happened under the Wesleys. Through their public preaching at churches and in the open air, people started not going to pubs. They left going to the pubs. And the publicans were complaining that the numbers were dropping in customers because people were getting converted. I have read of not one such incident in the whole of the Reformation in the 1500s, of preaching, whether it's in a church or in the open air, leading to multiple conversions and radically changed lives, where people suddenly cease from former habits. There's no record of that happening under the Reformers at Geneva at all. In one sense, one could say that Amy Perrine's mother was largely right. Calvin could only bring debates and wars without profit and peace, because the Reformers were engaged in rebuking the sins of a religious but worldly community instead of preaching the gospel to them and changing people's hearts. Calvin and his colleagues didn't spare the council itself, accusing it of moral laxity for not dealing properly with sexual immorality in the community. Here it is again. The council retorted that if there be such persons, then the preachers should use discretion and inform the council of it, instead of using the pulpit to publicly harangue the council about it. The Reformers were in this instance demanding that the civic authorities carry out punishments against immorality in the community. The state church system was alive and well, just as it had been under the Catholic Church since the time of Constantine. The historian Bruce Gordon, in his biography on Calvin, reflects what I have just been saying by summing it up in this way, quote, society for Calvin was mixed. The faithful live among the godless, who outnumber them greatly. And this is God's will. And the faithful are called to live in communities, not to exclude themselves. So if I interrupt his quote here, this is what we've seen since the time of the birth of the Catholic Church within the Holy Roman Empire. The church spreads its wings to include all of the community and impose religion on all of community. It does away with the concept of a converted, committed group of people constituting called out ones from society. All the reformers, as was the case from the Catholics from the 5th century, denied this scenario, this concept of the church. And this is what people, secular historians like Bruce Gordon, reflects in his own summing up. This was at the root of Calvin's objection to the Anabaptists, who of course called for a separate church of committed Christians, of converted people. To carry on with the quote, Christians remain sinners, and the piety of their church is imperfect, and the institutions of the church exist to deal with the constant cycle of sin and forgiveness. Teaching, worship, and admonition must sustain the Christian life. Calvin's mind was always turned to the community, and he never privileged the salvation of individuals. Just to interrupt the quote there, it just underlines what I've been saying in all the talks. Calvin's mind always turned to the community. Religion is imposed on the community. You don't separate those who you think are true Christians. It's the community. He never privileged the salvation of individuals. There is no true separation between the community and the church. It's all one. And he, to finalize the quote from Gordon, even the punishment of one person was to heal the whole body. So even a sort of godless, worldly person comes under the discipline, so-called discipline, of the so-called church, and is punished with rigor and even cruelty for the sake and edification of the whole community. So they're not just my thoughts. Various biographers, whether 20th century or earlier, there is an overlap in consensus in seeing, in judging what happened in this way. In 1547, new elections for important posts to the council executive changed things in favor of the anti-Calvin party. And on the 27th of June, a threatening letter was found in the pulpit of St. Pierre. It was a coarse letter with implicit, if not clear, death threats, telling the reformers to keep quiet in no uncertain terms and to stop blaming people and ruining their lives. Here it is again. The same reaction, the same grumbling and moans and complaints. Calvin now brings this letter before the council. And in the event, one Jacques Gruet was arrested, and he belonged to the anti-Calvin group. His house was searched, and a number of writings and letters were found which were critical of Calvin and very anti-religious in nature. In particular, a letter addressed to the magistrates was found. It highlighted the sentiments of not a few in Geneva. It said that they should not be ruled by the voice or will of one man. It argues that all men are different with their different natures, opinions, and likes and dislikes. It goes on to say, quote, therefore, it seems to me that a magistrate should establish a state in which there is no discord of making people subject to something against their nature, unquote. He was recognizing that the reformers were trying to push people into a mold that they did not fit. Now, leaving aside the nature and beliefs of this man Gruet, he is here making the point very clearly that you cannot make a leopard change its spots. You can't force people into something that is fundamentally contrary to their nature. Or if I may interpret it further, you cannot Christianize people. The legal outward imposition of modes of behavior could not work when it is contrary to the person's nature. Gruer's letter continues by acknowledging that, quote, everyone who maliciously and voluntarily hurts another deserves to be punished, unquote. But then he concludes with these words, quote, but suppose I am a man who wants to eat his meals as he pleases. What is that to do with the law? Nothing, unquote. It is undoubtedly true that Gruer wanted to have the liberty to enjoy more than just eating and drinking. Nevertheless, there is a logic to his argument. He, along with others, saw very clearly that the hat didn't fit that Calvin was trying to put on them. What business is it of the law to tell me what to do in my own house? Calvin and the reformers in Geneva, certainly, their rules and regulations followed people into their very houses to tell them what they could and couldn't do. However, Gruer was subjected to prolonged torture, which extracted from him a number of confessions, as a result of which he was beheaded in July 1547. And in 1550, when workmen were doing renovations on what had been his house, they discovered all manner of shocking and blasphemous material. And this gave a sense of justice to the citizens of Geneva for the sentence that had been inflicted on Gruer. And Calvin continued, and he inveighed against his writings, which were also then publicly burned at that time. But it is a sobering scenario where the initial criticisms of the French ministers led to the torture of a man to extract further confessions against the state and of heresy. Nevertheless, things were getting on top of Calvin. For about this time, it was about 1547 or 1548, he wrote, quote, I have not yet decided what I'm going to do, except that I can no longer tolerate the ways of this people, even though they may bear with mine. Nevertheless, Calvin revived from this mood and he struggled on. But the libertines continued in their opposition to Calvin, undermining him and stirring up trouble where they could. Where Calvin did suffer a defeat to the council was in church appointments. Without going into details, there was, for example, one pastor de ecclesia by name who had behaved badly and also taught error, and the ministers referred the matter to the council because they had no ultimate power to depose him. The council responded by saying that the ministers should forgive and reinstate him. However, the full meeting of the company of pastors decided that he should not be restored, and they told the council that. The chief magistrate, called the syndic at that time, was none other than Amy Perrin, and he informed the pastors that the ecclesia had been issued a final warning by the council, and he was to continue in the pastorate. The company of pastors were forced into submission on the matter. They couldn't override the council. And that's why I don't understand why there's no record of early on in 1541 and 1542, Calvin complaining about amendments that were made to the ordinances. But this was just one case among others where the council overruled the company of pastors on appointments and demotions. And this caused Calvin a lot of frustration. What turned out to be a very significant event and blow to Calvin was the arrival of a French refugee who was forced to leave France because of his evangelical preaching. His name was Jerome Balzac. He was a monk who turned his hand to being a medical doctor. He arrived in 1550 and settled just outside of Geneva. And early on, he was reprimanded in Geneva for challenging the doctrine of election, of predestination. Nevertheless, in the autumn of 1551, he attended a kind of Friday, it was a kind of Bible study called Congregation, where various pastors were present. And Balzac started speaking against Calvin's teaching on predestination, among other things saying it made God a tyrant and the author of evil. He accused Calvin's teaching of making an idol of God, turning God into something he wasn't. However, he didn't notice Calvin coming into the room and sitting down. When Balzac finished, Calvin stood up and spent 1 hour extempore refuting all Balzac's claims. At the end, but it didn't finish with just this sort of debate in this sort of eclectic group. At the end of the meeting, Balzac was arrested and taken to prison. Balzac was interrogated by the civil court, but it was beyond their knowledge to deliberate on matters so theologically complex. So Calvin and other ministers had to form the questions for the council to be put to the prisoner. So it became a kind of theological examination in front of the council. Now, Balzac wasn't a very competent theologian, but he certainly stood firm in the debate and remained in prison during this time. He also claimed that ministers from other churches of the Reformation sided with him. They could not let this go unchallenged. So Geneva sent a letter to other Swiss churches asking for their opinion before making a decision on the matter. No doubt Geneva expected a suitable judgment to be made against Balzac by the Swiss churches. However, things didn't quite turn out that way, and they certainly didn't turn out to Calvin's satisfaction or even in his favor. What made this a troublesome affair for him was the fact that Balzac had expressed views about Calvin's teaching that others also shared, even among his friends and co-reformers in other cities. In the end, the replies from the Swiss churches were a mixture of weak suggestions. Basil's response was lukewarm and evasive with regard to any punishment, and Calvin complained about their response in a letter to Farel, calling it cold and empty. However, that was nothing compared to the reply from the leading reformer Heinrich Bullinger in Zurich, who'd taken over from Zwingli. The church in Zurich expressed surprise that it was even being asked for its opinion on an issue that had already been settled in an official document of doctrinal agreement made between Zurich and Bern. And that had a particular Latin name, which I won't go into. But they were basically saying to Geneva, what's all the fuss about? Why are you writing to us? And moreover, they added that they felt Balzac had been treated too severely by the Genevans. They advised reconciliation be made with Balzac. This caused no end of annoyance and frustration to Calvin, as you might imagine, who felt he was being treated like an enemy and complained bitterly to Farel about Zurich's stand and Bullinger's response. In the same letter, he also complained about the lack of communication from the small council, which is also called the Senate, in Geneva, stating, quote, the Senate did not consider the pastors worthy of being written to, but heightened the insult. But to heighten the insult, they limited their communication to the magistrates. Calvin was feeling sidelined by the authorities in Geneva. It was another snub. All these things are quite important because they impinge on what happened later with Michael Servetus, when again the opinion of the Swiss cities was asked for. But I'll leave that for later. But Calvin also privately corresponded with Bullinger at this time. But Bullinger warned him that Balzac was only saying what others had been saying about his views on predestination. More than that, there was explicit criticism from Bullinger that Calvin had overstepped the mark regarding predestination and that he had gone beyond Scripture. He told Calvin, quote, now believe me, many are offended by your statements on predestination in your institutes, and Balzac has drawn from them the same conclusions, unquote. Well, you can imagine Calvin is not pleased with being told by a leading reformer that he'd gone beyond Scripture and virtually preaching heresy. So Calvin responds to Bullinger and in no uncertain terms seeks to defend himself and his teaching. But the Balzac affair ended up straining relationships between Calvin and the Swiss churches. After receiving the replies, the Genevan authorities banned Balzac from Geneva at the end of December. But things were far from over. Balzac went to the Bernese lands where he was allowed to voice his criticisms of Calvin and of Calvin's doctrines. And he soon drew in others who were already not enamored with Calvin. Now, Balzac was a rather eccentric figure, and eventually he did return to the Catholic Church, but he found fertile ground in the Bernese regions for his criticisms of Calvin. Calvin, in the end, had to go to Bern to clarify things and to secure peace, because Bern was very unsettled about what Calvin was doing and teaching. And although he was well received in Bern, reservations still remained. And those who had criticisms of Calvin were still allowed to voice them freely in Bern and its regions. This reached such a pitch that the Genevan Council actually wrote a letter to protest to Bern about the criticisms they were allowing in their regions. Now, the background to this is that Calvin had disaffected the Bernese, as we have seen, because of his opposition to their liturgical rites and criticism of their ministers that they sent him, as well as Calvin wanting the clerics to be in charge of the sanction of excommunication instead of the councils. Bern believed this belonged to the magistrates, not to the clerics. Bern was also worried that Calvin was a maverick in their midst, who was unduly influencing the whole of the French-speaking region with his own doctrinal views. So relations between Calvin and Bern were strained as ever. And later in 1540, sorry, I must have written this wrong. Anyway, it was later, I think in the 1550s, that Bern actually burnt some of Calvin's writings that they considered not consistent with their own teachings. So in the first half of the 1550s, things were not going well for Calvin. There were the tensions with Bern and continuing resentment of the preaching of the pastors in Geneva. Then the elections in February 1552 gave the Libertines a majority on the chief seats within the council, with Amy Perrin as first syndic, that is the chief executive magistrate. Then in 1553, the Perronists got positions on the consistory, which is the governing body for regulating church discipline. And thus they again threatened Calvin's position and his authority. And this was all a deliberate attempt by the Perronists not to expel Calvin because they wanted his strong leadership, but they wanted to clip his wings. Tensions and conflict between Calvin and the council emerged again over the issue of banning people from the Lord's Supper. Calvin claimed that this was the prerogative of the consistory, but was overruled at this time by the magistrates, who alone claimed this authority. It was a stressful time. When you read the biographies and the histories, there is a lot of debate, a lot of written work. It's a lot of stress and frustration for Calvin, a lot of infighting. And the council took less and less notice of the ministers in matters relating to church discipline and appointments, and even banned the ministers who were citizens of Geneva from sitting on the General Council of Geneva, which was open to all citizens. So that it was real infighting between the two groups. In 1553, Calvin writes, quote, "They have never shown a more unbridled license. The entire republic is now in disorder, and they are striving to uproot the established order," unquote. And in July of that year, 1553, Calvin had had enough and asked permission to resign. Thus it is recorded, quote, "Mr. Calvin has remonstrated and asked that the council will not be displeased if, since he sees that some wish him ill and many grumble and turn away from the word, he goes into retirement and serves no longer," unquote, from official documents. But his request is denied by the council. The Perronists wanted him under their control and not as a free agent who can align himself with reformers in other cities in opposition to them. There are those who claim that Calvin believed in the separation between the church and the state. These are, in general, apologists of the Reformed wing, even today, saying that Calvin believed in the separation between the church and the state. It is utter nonsense. You could say it's half true, but in essence, it's not true at all. We have seen how the reformers exhorted the magistrates to persecute, imprison, and kill dissenters to the Reformed religion. They believed the civil authority was ordained of God for this purpose. All the Protestant reformers continued this state church system that evolved from the time of Constantine. They believed in Christendom. The state and church are really one entity with two parts. According to this view, the church wields the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and the state wields the sword of physical punishment, with reference made to Romans 13, verses 1 to 6. And it is the state's duty before God to purge the community of ungodliness, idolatry, and heresy. Both are called of God to make and keep the community godly and Christian. These ideas are clearly expressed in Calvin's and other reformers' writings. And as we have seen, how Calvin expected and exhorted the civic powers to act in this way to promote and preserve what they believed to be true religion in its domains. The idea that Calvin believed in a separation of church and state is fundamentally and totally untrue. What is true is that although Calvin expected the state to fulfill its divine duty in punishing the immoral and the heretic in society, he believed that these civic powers should not interfere in the running of the church itself, particularly in his running of the church. That was his idea of a so-called separation between the two. But it is naive to think that those who hold the keys of power, that is the state, will end up being so subservient to those who actually depend on them for their existence, that is the church. As I have mentioned, this tension between the two is inbuilt into this unholy alliance of church and state, which was constituted at the time of Constantine. Calvin would have been horrified at the notion that the state had nothing to do with upholding the one true religion in its domain. He would have been horrified at that. The two work in tandem at securing and imposing religion on its citizens. And that brings us to the case of Michael Servetus, which we will look at next time. And that really highlights what I've just been saying. And I hope that to be the final summing up. The final look at Calvin will only take a part of the next talk, and the remainder of the talk I hope to make a resume of the 10 talks up to now. So thank you for listening this time, and goodbye to everyone. Thank you.